My family skipped my biggest moment. But when my $92 million valuation hit Forbes, Dad texted, "Family dinner at 7 p.m. Important discussion." I showed up looking like I had nothing, driving a beat-up sedan. They thought they were going to manipulate their invisible son into handing over a fortune to save their sinking ship. They smiled, they poured expensive champagne, and they waited for me to open my wallet. What they didn't know was that I didn't bring a checkbook. I brought the very documents that would strip them of everything they owned. Before I tell you how this whole trap snapped shut on them, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. My name is Nathan. I am 30 years old, and I live right in the heart of the city, running a logistics technology company that I built entirely from the ground up. It was a random Tuesday afternoon. The sky outside my office window was a dull, overcast. It was my father. I just stared at the glowing letters for a moment. For the last 8 months, my phone had been a graveyard when it came to my family. Complete and utter silence. There were no calls to check in on me, no quick texts asking how my week was going, no invitations to holiday gatherings. As far as the Miller family was concerned, I simply did not exist. But now, out of nowhere, a text message. I swiped the screen open and read the short, demanding words. "Family celebration tonight. Important news about the expansion. Don't be late. 7 p.m. at the country club." I read it twice. He didn't ask if I was free. He didn't ask how I was doing. It was a summons, pure and simple. I leaned back in my leather chair, the leather creaking slightly in the quiet office. I looked back down at the text message. I used to cry when they ignored me. When I was younger, I used to bend over backwards, begging for just a tiny fraction of their attention or approval. But staring at those harsh, demanding words now, I didn't feel sad anymore. I felt entirely awake. They thought they were inviting their quiet, desperate, people-pleasing son to dinner. They thought they could just snap their fingers and I would come running back to the table. But they were dead wrong. They weren't inviting a son. They were inviting a bank account. And they had absolutely no idea that this particular bank was about to close its doors on them forever. I locked my phone, stood up, and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city traffic. I wasn't going to ignore the text. I was going to go to that dinner. But I wasn't going to be the man they expected. I was going to give them exactly what they deserved. To understand exactly why I felt nothing but ice when I read my father's text message, you have to understand the night of the rain. You have to understand the night I finally thought I had made it, the night that broke the last remaining string holding me to my family. It was exactly 2 years ago. It was the night of my Series B funding announcement. In the brutal, fast-paced startup world, securing Series B funding is a massive milestone. It means you survived the culling. It means serious, heavy-hitting investors have looked at your books, looked at your business model, and decided to bet tens of millions of dollars on your vision. You aren't just a kid with a dream anymore. You are a real player in the market. I had just secured $20 million in funding. It was, without a doubt, the hardest thing I had ever done in my entire life. I had worked grueling 18-hour days for months on end. I had eaten cheap, microwavable noodles standing up in my kitchen and slept on the hard carpet of my office floor more times than I could count. I had pitched my heart out to room after room of wealthy men in suits who looked at me like I was a lost intern who wandered into the wrong building. But I did it. I won. I survived the gauntlet and I wanted to celebrate. I didn't want to go out drinking with strangers or business associates. I wanted to share this moment with the people who were supposed to love me. So I went all out. I booked a private dining room at Le Jardin, the most exclusive and expensive French restaurant in the city. It was exactly the kind of place my parents worshipped. It had heavy white tablecloths, glittering crystal glassware, and waiters who moved silently in sharp tuxedos. I ordered the best vintage wine they had in the cellar. I pre-ordered the massive seafood tower that I knew my mother loved. I specifically asked the chef to prepare the dry-aged steak exactly the way my father always talked about. I arrived early and at 7:15 p.m., the room was still completely empty. The silence was thick. I checked my phone. Not a single text message. The waiter came by, a professional smile on his face, and asked if we were ready to begin. I forced a smile back. "They are just running a little late," I told him. "Traffic is probably bad downtown." The waiter nodded kindly and poured me a glass of ice water. At 7:45 p.m., the ice in my water glass had melted. I pulled out my phone and texted my older brother, Julian. "Hey, you guys close? The food is ready." A few minutes later, Julian texted back. "Can't make it, man. Something came up with the custody arrangement for the kids. My ex-wife is being a nightmare. Have a drink for me." I stared at the screen. My jaw tightened. I knew for an absolute fact that Julian didn't have his kids that weekend. It was his ex-wife's scheduled weekend, and she was strict about it because of their messy divorce. He was lying straight to my face. He couldn't even bother to come up with a believable excuse. I didn't call him out on it. I just typed back, "Okay." 5 empty chairs. In the dim lighting of the restaurant, they looked like teeth in a giant, dark mouth that was silently laughing at me. At 8 p.m., I finally sent a text to my mother. "Hey Mom, everything okay? I'm at the restaurant." She didn't reply right away. 10 agonizing minutes ticked by. I sat there, listening to the soft clinking of silverware from the main dining room outside our private area. Finally, my phone buzzed. I opened the message. "Oh, honey, I have such a terrible migraine. The pain is just blinding. I can't even get out of bed. I am so sorry. Take lots of pictures of the food for us." I stared at the glowing screen, my chest feeling tight and heavy. It felt like someone had wrapped a tight band around my ribs. A migraine, right? I shouldn't have done it, but a sick, sinking feeling in my gut told me to check social media. I opened Instagram. I scrolled past a few posts and then clicked on my cousin's story. There it was. A video posted less than 5 minutes ago. The location tag was a trendy downtown rooftop bar, nowhere near our family home. The video was loud, pulsing with heavy bass music. And right there, standing in the dead center of the frame, was my mother. She was wearing a sparkling cocktail dress, holding a massive martini glass, and throwing her head. I watched the video loop again. The camera panned, and I saw the banner hanging across the bar. It was Carter's influencer launch party. Carter, my younger brother, the golden child. He had woken up a week ago and decided he was tired of trying to get a job, so he was going to be a luxury lifestyle influencer instead. He had no business plan, no actual income, and no real skills. But he had a party. And my parents, my brother Julian and Uncle Jeffrey, had all chosen to go to a fake launch party for a jobless 25-year-old over my $20 million career milestone. My father didn't even bother to text me a lie. He just completely ignored my existence. I sat in that beautiful, expensive room for another full hour. The silence was deafening. Eventually, the waiter came back in. He looked incredibly uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Would you like to order dinner for yourself, sir?" he asked softly, his eyes pitying me. I looked at the 5 empty chairs. I looked at the massive seafood tower sitting in the center of the table. The ice now completely melted. The expensive shrimp and oysters sitting in lukewarm water. "No," I said. My voice sounded small, raspy. "Just the check, please." I paid the bill. It was $400 for food that absolutely nobody ate. I tipped the waiter generously because it wasn't his fault my family was broken. I walked out of the restaurant and onto the street. It had started to rain, a cold, heavy downpour. I didn't pull out my umbrella. I just stood there on the sidewalk and let the freezing water soak through my brand new charcoal suit. That night in the rain wasn't the first time they had abandoned me. It was just the time that finally shattered whatever illusion I had left. The pattern of being the invisible middle child had been etched into my life since I was old enough to walk. It was written into the history of every missed birthday, every forgotten school event, and every dismissed achievement. I remember when I was 12 years old. I had spent 3 months building a working, motorized model of a water filtration system for the state science fair. I poured my heart into it. I won first place in my district and was heading to the state finals on a Saturday. I was practically buzzing with pride. "We can't go, Nathan," my dad had said that morning, not even bothering to look up from his coffee and the morning financial news. "Carter has his soccer game." "But Dad," I pleaded, my voice cracking. "Carter plays soccer literally every single weekend. This is the state finals. It's a one-time event." My mother had slammed her coffee mug down on the granite counter. "Don't be selfish, Nathan," she snapped, glaring at me. "Your brother needs our support today. He's the team captain. You can't just make everything about you." They went to the soccer game. Carter's team lost by 3 goals. Carter threw a tantrum on the field, and they bought him a massive ice cream sundae to soothe. When I graduated college, they left the ceremony an hour early because Uncle Jeffrey said he was bored and wanted to beat the traffic to get a beer. When I first came up with the idea for my tech company, I sat down in my father's study. I swallowed my pride and asked him for a small loan. Just $5,000 to buy a decent commercial server to host my initial code. My father had sighed heavily, dragging his hand down his face as if I had just asked him to sell his soul. "Nathan," he said, using his condescending business voice, "startups are a guaranteed failure. You need to be realistic. Go out, find a stable corporate job, and earn a steady salary like a normal person. I am not going to throw my hard-earned money away on your little computer hobby." I walked out of his study with nothing. 2 weeks later, Julian complained that his old sedan wasn't executive enough for his fake management role at Dad's company. Dad went out the next day and bought Julian a brand new $40,000 Porsche. They didn't hate me. Honestly, hate would have been so much easier to process. If they actively hated me, it would mean I mattered enough to provoke an actual emotional response. No, it was much worse than hate. They just didn't care. I was the furniture in the house. I was the background noise. I was safe, boring Nathan, the kid who never caused a scandal, who never needed to be bailed out of jail, who never demanded their attention. They punished me for being independent. Because I didn't constantly need them to clean up my messes, they gave me absolutely nothing. All the love, the money, and the attention went to Carter and Julian, who were absolute disasters demanding constant rescue. So, when I stood in my office looking at that text message today, 8 months after the silent treatment began, I didn't feel a single shred of hope. I just remembered the freezing rain outside Le Jardin. I remembered the 5 empty chairs. I remembered the heavy state metal burning a hole in my pocket. I knew exactly why they were calling. They weren't calling because they missed their son. They were calling because the little computer hobby they had laughed out of the room was now worth $92 million. They were calling because they were hungry, and they saw me as a walking, breathing ATM machine. I left the office and drove back to my penthouse apartment. I walked into my walk-in closet and stood in front of the massive mirror. I had to make a critical choice about what to wear to this family dinner. My closet is full of success now. I have rows of custom-tailored Italian suits. I have silk ties, expensive watches, and shoes that cost more than my first apartment's rent. I could have easily dressed exactly like the powerful CEO that I am. I could have walked into that country club. Then I stopped. I pulled my hand back. No, if I walked into that room looking like a millionaire, their defenses would immediately go up. They would see a shark entering the tank. They would put on their best behavior, they would measure their words, and they would hide their true intentions behind a wall of fake corporate respect. I didn't want them on guard. I needed them to see a mouse. I needed them to look at me and think absolutely nothing had changed. I needed them to feel vastly superior to me. Because when people like my family feel superior, they get sloppy. They get arrogant. They drop their masks and reveal exactly who they are. I left the navy suit on the hanger. Instead, I dug deep into the back of my closet and pulled out a pair of plain, faded black trousers and a simple, washed-out gray sweater. It was clean, but it was incredibly old. There was a tiny, noticeable loose thread hanging off the left cuff. I bypassed my leather Oxfords and put on a pair of comfortable, slightly scuffed walking shoes. I looked in the mirror. I ran my hands through my hair to mess it up a bit, making myself look tired and worn down. I looked exactly like the Nathan they remembered. The struggling Nathan. The boring, invisible Nathan. Perfect, I whispered to my reflection. I grabbed my keys and took the private elevator down to the underground parking garage. Parked in my prime, brightly lit spot was... I grabbed the keys to the sedan. When I turned the key, the engine coughed and sputtered before finally catching. The air conditioning vents rattled loudly, blowing out air that smelled faintly of old coffee and stale dust. It was the exact smell of my past struggles. I gripped the worn steering wheel, pulled out of the garage, and drove out into the darkening city. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and dialed a number. "Alina," I said when my CFO picked up. "I'm here, Nathan. The legal team has reviewed everything. We are fully armed and ready. I am on standby waiting for your signal." "Good," I said, my voice cold and steady. "I'm heading into the Lion's Den now." The drive to the Oak Haven Country Club took about 40 minutes in the heavy evening traffic. As I navigated the rattling sedan through the streets, I could feel a familiar, dark shadow creeping up my spine. It was the old anxiety, the conditioned response of a child who was always told he wasn't good enough. It was a very physical sensation. My stomach started to tie itself into tight knots. My hands were gripping the peeling steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My brain automatically started playing the old toxic tapes from my childhood. "You're too sensitive, Nathan. Why can't you just take a joke? Why can't you be fun and outgoing like Carter? You always ruin the mood by being so serious all the time." I took a deep, shaky breath, filling my lungs, and forced myself to exhale slowly. I stared at the red taillights of the car in front of me and grounded myself in reality. I am not that invisible kid anymore, I reminded myself fiercely. I am the CEO of a global tech firm. I manage hundreds of brilliant employees. I make executive decisions that move tens of millions of dollars across borders every single day. I have ruthlessly fired executives who are 10 times scarier than my father. I have negotiated contracts with tycoons who are 100 times smarter than my mother. They have absolutely no idea who is walking into that room tonight. They only know a weak memory of me. I turned off the main highway and pulled up to the grand, imposing iron gates of the Oak Haven Country Club. The security guard, a burly guy in a crisp uniform, stepped out of his booth. He took one look at my dented, faded sedan and his face instantly contorted into a sneer of deep suspicion. He didn't even bother to hide his disdain. He leaned out, pointing a thick finger down the road. "Delivery entrance is around the back, buddy," he said rudely, waving me off. I rolled down my squeaky window. I didn't smile. I didn't show any emotion. "I am not a delivery," I said, my voice flat and commanding. "I am here for the Miller family dinner. My name is Nathan Miller." The guard paused. He looked down at his heavy clipboard, scanning the names. He frowned deeply, his eyes darting back up to my cheap car, clearly trying to reconcile the wealthy Miller name with the piece of junk I was driving. "Right?" he muttered, clearly unimpressed. "Go ahead." He waved me through with a lazy flick of his wrist, treating me like an annoyance. He didn't respect me at all, and that was absolutely perfect. It was the first confirmation that my disguise was working flawlessly. I drove slowly up the long, winding, perfectly paved driveway. The landscaping on either side was aggressively manicured. The grass was cut to the exact same millimeter of height. The expensive flowers were arranged in rigid, unnatural perfect circles. The whole place was a monument to superficiality. It was all shiny surface and zero substance. It was fake, expensive, and hollow, exactly like the family waiting inside. I pulled into the VIP parking area right near the grand entrance. I spotted the family fleet immediately. I parked my dirty, rattling sedan right in the front row. On my left was my father's massive, polished black Rolls-Royce. It looked like a tank built for royalty. On my right was Julian's bright silver Porsche, the one Dad had bought with company funds. I knew for an absolute fact that Julian's fake salary couldn't even cover the monthly insurance premiums on that machine. My beat-up sedan sat wedged between their extravagant luxury cars like a dirty, rusted stain on a clean white shirt. I turned off the engine. The car shuddered and died. I sat in the quiet cabin for a long moment, staring at the massive wooden doors of the club. This was it. I was walking back into the very place where I had been manipulated and diminished my entire life. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. I wiped every trace of emotion from my face. No anger, no fear, no excitement, just a blank, unreadable slate. I opened the door and stepped out into the crisp night air. The air outside smelled strongly of fresh-cut grass and overwhelming, expensive perfume. I walked slowly up the wide stone steps, the soles of my scuffed shoes making no sound. I reached out and pulled open the heavy brass handles of the main doors. My heart wasn't racing anymore. It was beating in a slow, steady rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. I wasn't a desperate boy walking in to beg for a scrap of love. I wasn't an arrogant, newly rich kid walking in to show off. I was a predator walking into a trap I had already disarmed. I was walking in to close a deal. I navigated the plush, quiet lobby and approached the private dining area. I pushed open the double doors of the room they always booked. They called it the Gold Room. The walls were paneled in rich, dark cherry wood, and a massive crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling, catching the light like a frozen explosion of shattered glass. In the center of the room was a large round table set elegantly for 6. This time, unlike 2 years ago, there were no empty chairs. Every single one of them was there, waiting. My father, Robert, sat at the head of the table. He was wearing his signature power outfit, a sharp navy pinstripe suit, a red silk tie, and a heavy gold watch. It was the armor he wore when he wanted to intimidate people in boardrooms. My mother, Eleanor, sat to his right, wearing a designer dress that glittered sharply under the chandelier lights. Across from them sat my brothers, Julian and Carter. Julian looked stressed, his tie slightly crooked, while Carter was already slouched in his chair, mindlessly scrolling through his phone. Uncle Jeffrey was slouched at the end of the table, his face already slightly flushed, nursing a dark amber glass of scotch. The second my worn shoes stepped onto the thick carpet, the theatrical performance began. "There he is!" my mother practically shrieked. It was a high-pitched, incredibly fake sound that grated on my nerves. She stood up so violently that her heavy wooden chair scraped loudly against the floor. She rushed across the room toward me. Before I could even brace myself, she threw her arms around my neck. She smelled strongly of hairspray and gin. Her hug was tight, almost suffocating, but it was entirely performative. It was a hug designed for an audience, not for a son. She held me for about 3 seconds too long. "We missed you so much, Nady," she cooed, pulling back and holding me by the shoulders to look at me. She used the nickname Nady. She hadn't called me that since I was in elementary school. Usually, I was just Nathan or a dismissive "Hey." "Hi, Mom," I said. My voice was completely flat. I didn't wrap my arms around her. I just let them hang limply at my sides. If she noticed my coldness, she didn't care. She hooked her arm through mine and guided me toward the table like a prize pony she was trotting out for a show. "Look who finally made time for the family," my father boomed. He stood up, his massive frame dominating the space, and thrust his hand out. My father loves to squeeze your hand during a handshake until the bones grind together. It's his pathetic way of establishing dominance. I took his hand. His grip was hard and aggressive. I didn't flinch. I squeezed back, locking my grip just a fraction harder than his. I saw a flicker of genuine surprise flash across his eyes for a split second before he masked it with a loud, booming laugh. Sit down, son," he ordered, waving me toward an empty chair between Julian and Uncle Jeffrey. "We already ordered the champagne. Dom Perignon. Only the absolute best for a night like tonight." I sat down. Julian leaned over, looking me up and down. He had dark circles under his eyes, and he smelled faintly of sweat and cheap cologne despite his expensive suit. "Hey, little bro," Julian smirked, his eyes dropping to my frayed sleeve. "Nice sweater. Did you pick that up at a thrift store on the way here?" "Julian, stop it," Mom scolded him, though a cruel little smile played on her lips. "Don't tease your brother. He's just being thrifty. That's how the rich stay rich. Right, Nathan?" "Something like that," I replied, carefully unfolding the linen napkin and placing it silently on my lap. Uncle Jeffrey slammed his empty glass down on the table. "I always said it," he slurred slightly. "I always told everyone that Nathan is a grinder. He's got the famous Miller work ethic running through his veins." I almost laughed out loud at the absurdity of it. Uncle Jeffrey hadn't worked a legitimate job in 2 decades. He lived entirely off an inheritance my grandfather had set up, draining the trust fund dry. The Miller work ethic he was bragging about was a complete myth. My father inherited the company, Julian was handed a fake promotion, and Carter refused to work at all. I was the only person at this table who had actually built something from nothing. But tonight, reality didn't matter. Tonight, my success was suddenly a proud family trait. They were rewriting history right in front of my face, buttering me up for the slaughter. The waiter arrived, carrying the chilled bottle of Dom Perignon like it was a holy relic. He popped the cork with a soft, expensive sigh and poured the golden liquid into 6 tall crystal flutes. My father picked up his glass and held it high. "To family," Dad declared loudly, looking directly at me with fake warmth, "and to monumental success." "To family," everyone echoed like a well-rehearsed choir. I picked up my flute. I touched the rim to my lips, but I didn't let a single drop of the alcohol pass my teeth. I set it back down and watched them. They drank greedily, practically gulping the expensive champagne. "So," Carter finally spoke up, barely lifting his eyes from his phone screen. "I saw the Forbes article this morning. 92 million. That is absolutely insane, bro." "It's a company valuation, Carter," I said quietly, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "It's not liquid cash sitting in a checking account. It means investors look at the platform's revenue and potential and believe the company is worth that amount." "Still," Dad interrupted, waving his large hand dismissively in the air, "it is incredibly impressive. Who would have ever thought? Our quiet, serious little Nathan running a massive tech empire. It's a global logistics and supply chain optimization platform, Dad," I corrected him. "Not just a tech empire." Right, computer stuff," Dad chuckled, clearly not understanding and not caring. "Very smart. I always knew you had a head for numbers." The appetizers arrived. Massive plates of shrimp cocktail, fresh oysters on the half-shell, and prime beef tartare. It was an absolute feast, a ridiculous display of wealth. "Eat up, everyone," Dad commanded, making sure his voice carried so the waiter could hear him. "This entire dinner is on me tonight." He said it with such arrogant pride, as if paying for dinner was some grand, heroic sacrifice. As we ate, they launched into a barrage of complaints about their incredibly difficult lives. Carter whined endlessly about how the Instagram algorithm was shadow banning his posts and destroying his brand. Julian grumbled bitterly about his ex-wife demanding more money in the divorce settlement, complaining that he couldn't survive on his current salary. Mom dramatically sighed about how the contractor messed up the Italian marble tile for their vacation home renovations. They were treating me like an old, dear friend. They were laughing, dragging me into their inside jokes, and constantly signaling the waiter to top off my untouched champagne glass. If a stranger had peeked through the door of the gold room, they would have seen a picture-perfect, wealthy American family enjoying a lovely Tuesday dinner. But I wasn't a stranger. I saw the cracks hidden beneath the expensive makeup. I saw the way my father nervously checked the heavy gold watch on his wrist every 5 minutes. I saw the way my mother's bright, fake smile instantly vanished the second she turned her head away. I saw Julian's leg bouncing erratically under the table, tapping out a rhythm of pure anxiety. They were incredibly anxious. They were rushing through the polite small talk. They were acting like bad actors desperate to get to the main scene. They were softening the target. I decided I had seen enough of the opening act. I wanted to see the main event. I wanted to see exactly how much they thought my soul was worth. I carefully set my silver fork down on my plate. I wiped my mouth slowly with the linen napkin. I looked directly across the table, locking eyes with my father. "So," I said, my voice cutting through Carter's whining like a knife, "your text message said you had important news about an expansion." The atmosphere in the room shifted so violently it gave me whiplash. The fake laughter died instantly. The chewing stopped. Uncle Jeffrey froze with his glass halfway to his mouth. Dad straightened his tie, pulled his shoulders back, and exchanged a quick, highly rehearsed look with my mother. "Showtime." "Yes," Dad said. His voice dropped an octave, adopting his serious, authoritative businessman tone. "I am very glad you brought that up, Nathan." He reached down to the floor beside his chair and hoisted up a heavy, black leather briefcase. He dropped it onto the table with a loud thud. Snap, snap. He undid the latches and pulled out a thick, glossy presentation folder, sliding it across the white tablecloth until it stopped right in front of my plate. The cover featured a massive, high-definition 3D rendering of a futuristic, gleaming building made of glass and cedar wood, surrounded by photoshopped palm trees. In elegant gold foil lettering at the bottom, it read, "The Miller Resort and Spa, a new era." "Open it," Dad urged, leaning forward on his elbows. I didn't touch the glossy folder. I just looked at the shiny gold letters, then looked back up at him. "What is this, Dad?" "You know the motel chain has been the financial backbone of this family for 40 years, Dad began, his voice smooth and practiced. "Your grandfather built the first one. I built the next 5. But the market is evolving, Nathan. People don't want cheap highway motels anymore. They want luxury. They want holistic experiences." He pointed a thick, manicured finger at the rendering. "This is the future of our legacy. We are going to bulldoze the flagship property, the Old Miller Inn. We are going to build a 5-star luxury wellness retreat. Organic dining, private yoga studios, cabanas at $400 a night. It's going to be absolutely gorgeous, Nady." Mom chimed in, leaning forward with wide, shining eyes. "I'm personally designing the meditation gardens. It will be the premier destination in the state. It's a guaranteed slam dunk," Julian added aggressively, thumping his fist on the table. "I've run the numbers. The demographics are perfect. We're going to print money." I finally reached out and flipped the cover open. I ignored the pretty pictures of smiling models doing yoga. I looked straight at the raw financial projections printed in small text in the corners of the pages. "This is a massive capital project," I said, keeping my face entirely blank. "Construction alone has to be around $15 million. 18, Dad corrected me proudly, puffing out his chest. "To do it the right way. No cutting corners." "And you have the financing fully secured for an $18 million build?" I asked softly. Dad cleared his throat. He reached for his water glass and took a slow sip. "This was it. This was the pivot. We have the primary institutional investors lined up," he lied smoothly. "The bank is fully on board for the main construction loan. But you know how these massive commercial banks are, Nathan. They are bureaucratic. They are painfully slow. Before they release the primary funds, they want to see a certain amount of liquid capital injected up front. A bridge loan, so to speak, to clear the old land liens and break ground." He paused, offering me a smile that was meant to look like warm, fatherly pride. To me, it looked like a starving wolf baring its teeth. "We realized," Dad continued, lowering his voice intimately, "that we shouldn't be paying all this high interest to strangers on Wall Street. We should keep the wealth inside the family. We want to offer you the exclusive chance to be a primary partner in this." "A partner?" I asked. "We need a bridge loan," Julian snapped, cutting through the corporate doublespeak, "to clear the dirt and start digging." "How much?" I asked. Dad locked eyes with me. He didn't blink. $1.5 million. The room went completely, terrifyingly silent. Nobody breathed. Mom was twisting her diamond ring nervously. Carter had actually put his phone face down on the table. 1.5 million, I repeated slowly, letting the massive number hang in the heavy air. It's a secured loan, Dad added quickly, sensing hesitation. With a guaranteed return. We'll pay you back in exactly 2 years with a 6% interest rate. That is far better yield than you'll ever get leaving it sitting in a standard savings account. It's an investment in your own family's legacy, honey, Mom pleaded softly, reaching out as if to touch my arm, but stopping short. This resort is going to be an empire we leave to your children one day. Don't you want to be the one who helped build that? I felt a sharp, violent spike of pure anger ignite in my chest. The utter audacity. When I needed $5,000 to start my life, he told me to get a normal job with a salary. When I succeeded entirely without them, they wanted $1.5 million to fund a fantasy. I pushed the anger down, burying it deep. You said the bank is fully on board? I asked, turning a page in the folder. Oh, absolutely, Dad lied without a flinch. They love the vision. They just need us to show some skin in the game. Very standard practice. Which bank? I asked. Dad blinked, caught slightly off guard by the specific question. First National. We've banked with them for 3 decades. And First National is entirely comfortable with the current occupancy rates of the existing motels? I asked casually. Julian shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Occupancy is... It's just a seasonal dip. It's a little soft right now. But that's exactly why we are pivoting. The old motel model is dead. Right? I said. So you need $1.5 million right now to demolish the old building and start fresh? Exactly. Dad smiled broadly, showing his teeth. He thought he had won. He thought he was looking at the naive, desperate son who just wanted to buy his father's love. He thought my checkbook was already out. It's an absolute no-brainer, Nathan. We wanted to honor you by giving you the first right of refusal. Honor me? I said flatly. I closed the glossy folder and placed both my hands flat on top of it. I have a few questions. Of course, son, Dad said, waving his hand magnanimously, radiating false confidence. Ask me anything. Total transparency. You said the bank is First National, I said slowly. And you said occupancy is just experiencing a seasonal dip. Yes and yes, Dad nodded enthusiastically. I reached down into my worn messenger bag. I didn't pull out a checkbook. I pulled out a thin, sleek gray tablet. I hit the power button. The screen glowed a cold blue in the dim lighting of the gold room. I swiped open a heavily encrypted file. That's very funny, I said, tapping the glass screen, because I like to do a little routine due diligence before I attend business meetings. Public financial records are fascinating things to read. Dad's arrogant smile faltered just a fraction of an inch. A tiny bead of sweat appeared near his hairline. What exactly do you mean by that? He asked, his voice suddenly losing its booming resonance. Well, I said, scrolling down the PDF document so they could all see the official county seals. According to the county clerk's office, First National Bank didn't approve a construction loan for any resort. I looked up, locking my eyes onto his. Actually, First National filed a formal notice of default against the Miller in exactly 3 months ago. The silence that slammed into the room was not the silence of anticipation. It was the suffocating silence of a live grenade that had just been dropped directly onto the center of the dining table, the pin already pulled. That's a massive misunderstanding, Dad stammered. The color began to drain rapidly from his face. His hands, which had been resting confidently on the table, dropped into his lap. It's a clerical error. The lawyers are sorting it out as we speak. I didn't stop. I pressed the attack. And occupancy isn't a seasonal dip, Julian. According to the state tax filings, your occupancy has been hovering under 40% for 2 consecutive years. I tapped the screen harder. You aren't pivoting to a luxury resort because you have some grand architectural vision, Dad. You are pivoting because you are bleeding cash from every artery. I pushed the tablet toward the center of the table. You do not need $1.5 million for a bridge loan. You need $1.5 million to stop First National from seizing the commercial property on the 1st of next month. You are entirely insolvent. Mom gasped loudly, pressing her hand over her mouth. Nathan, how dare you use that word in this room? It is the mathematical truth, Mom, I said, my voice as cold and hard as steel. The family business isn't a gold mine. It is a sinking ship. And you invited me here tonight, poured me champagne, and hugged me because you want me to blindly pay for your lifeboats. It's a temporary cash flow issue, Julian yelled, slamming his hand on the table, knocking over his water glass. You don't understand the hospitality operations market. You stare at computer screens all day. Is it standard hospitality operations to borrow money from a predatory hard money lender at 18% interest? I fired back, pulling up the next document on the screen. I watched Julian's face turn ghost white. You took out a massive second mortgage against the land 3 years ago. Not from a bank. From a shady private equity group out of Chicago. I scrolled to the disbursement section, though I had already memorized every single line. And you didn't use that equity to renovate the dying motels. You stripped the equity out of the company to fund executive bonuses. You used it to pay for Julian's brand new Porsche. You used it to fund Carter's fake influencer lifestyle instead of his college fund. I turned my gaze to my mother's wrist, which was adorned with glittering diamonds. You used it to buy jewelry. We earned those bonuses. Mom cried out indignantly, her voice shrill with panic. Your father built this empire from scratch. He deserves to drive a nice car. Do you expect us to live like absolute peasants? I expect you to pay your legally binding debts, I stated simply. The facade was completely gone now. The polite, loving family act had shattered into a million jagged pieces. Dad slammed both of his massive fists onto the table. The silverware clattered loudly against the china plates. His face was a dark, dangerous shade of purple, and the veins in his neck were bulging against his silk collar. That is enough, Dad roared. The sound echoed off the cherry wood walls. The fake warmth was entirely replaced by pure, toxic rage. Who the hell do you think you are, coming into my club, investigating your own flesh and blood? We came to you with a lucrative opportunity, and you treat us like criminals. You came to me with a premeditated lie. I shot back, not breaking eye contact. We raised you, he bellowed, standing up from his chair and looming over the table. He pointed a violently shaking finger directly at my face. We put a roof over your head. We put clothes on your back. You owe us. I owe you absolutely nothing, I said. I pushed my chair back and stood up slowly. I wasn't as tall as my father, but at that moment, I felt like a giant looking down at a cornered rat. My legs were trembling slightly from adrenaline, but my voice was rock solid. You ignored my existence for 8 months. You missed my Series B announcement. You missed every milestone of my life. But the absolute second you saw a $sign printed next to my name in a magazine, you suddenly remembered you had a middle son. You selfish little prick, Julian snarled. He pushed his chair back violently and lunged forward, his hands balling into tight fists. He looked like he was ready to swing at me right across the table. Sit down, Julian, I commanded sharply. The authority in my voice was so absolute, so commanding, that Julian physically flinched. He stopped dead in his tracks and slowly sank back into his chair, looking shocked by his own obedience. I am not done, I said, sweeping my gaze across all of them. The unhinged anger in their eyes was rapidly being replaced by something much sweeter. Pure, unadulterated fear. They realized I wasn't guessing. I knew everything. The game was entirely up. You're doing this just to punish us? Carter whined, his voice trembling. He looked like a terrified child. It's $1.5 million, Nathan. That is literally pocket change to you now. You're just being a vindictive monster. I am not punishing you, I replied calmly. I am making a rational business decision based on data. The exact same way you made a business decision to skip my celebration dinner. The exact same way you made a business decision to ignore my text messages. You can't hold a grudge forever, Mom wailed. She was frantically dabbing her eyes with her linen napkin, smearing expensive black mascara down her cheeks. It's not right. Family is supposed to stick together. What about loyalty? Loyalty is a two-way street, Mom, I said, looking at her tears and feeling absolutely nothing. You were loyal to the money. You were never loyal to me. Uncle Jeffrey, who had been hiding behind his scotch glass, suddenly stood up, swaying heavily on his feet. You're a cold-blooded block of ice, Nathan, he slurred, pointing a wobbly finger at me. No wonder your wife left you. Oh wait, you never even had one. No one wants a miserable miser who counts pennies instead of helping his own blood. The insult hung in the air. 5 years ago, those words would have cut me to the bone. 5 years ago, I would have broken down, apologized, and written the check just to make the screaming stop, just to buy 5 minutes of fake peace. But I stood there in my cheap, frayed sweater, looking at these panicked, desperate people, and I realized something profound. Every single insult they threw at me was like a pair of scissors cutting the toxic cords that had bound me to them. Snip, there went my need for my father's pride. Snip, there went my desire for my mother's warmth. Snip, there went my guilt. I was finally completely free. Are you all quite finished? I asked quietly. Dad sat back down heavily, panting, looking defeated. Get out, he growled, refusing to look at me. If you aren't going to help us, get out of my sight. You are dead to us. I've been dead to you for a long time, Dad, I said. I just finally accepted it. I reached up and tapped the small Bluetooth earpiece hidden in my left ear. Alina, I said clearly into the microphone. Come in. It's time. The heavy double doors of the gold room swung open with a solid, definitive thud. Every single pair of eyes at the table snapped away from my face and darted toward the entrance. My chief financial officer, Alina, walked into the room. She was wearing a perfectly tailored, razor-sharp gray suit. Her high heels clicked rhythmically against the hardwood border of the floor before she stepped onto the plush carpet, silencing her footsteps. She looked entirely out of place in this room full of emotional, sweating, panicking people. She looked like a highly paid executioner arriving to finish a job. She carried a thick, heavy stack of legal documents pressed firmly against her side. Alina did not offer a polite smile. She did not introduce herself to my parents. She completely ignored Julian, who was still half standing with his fists clenched, and she didn't even glance at Uncle Jeffrey, who was gripping his scotch glass like a lifeline. She walked directly to my side, stepping into the space right between me and my father. She placed the massive stack of documents directly in front of me on the white tablecloth. Everything is fully prepared and legally verified, Nathan, Alina said. Her voice was cool, professional, and entirely devoid of emotion. The lawyers have signed off on the final transfers. I am on standby. My father stared at Alina, then stared down at the documents. The deep, angry purple color in his face was rapidly draining away, replaced by a sickly, pale gray. He was sweating profusely now. The collar of his expensive dress shirt looked like it was choking him. I told you to get out of my sight, Dad growled. Though his voice lacked the booming authority it had just 2 minutes ago, it sounded weak. It sounded like a man who suddenly realized he was standing on a trapdoor. I don't know who this woman is, and I don't care. If you aren't going to give us the bridge loan, take your cheap clothes and leave. We will find the money somewhere else. We don't need you. I rested my hand flat on top of the fresh stack of papers. The top folder was a stark, heavy blue. It didn't have any glossy pictures of palm trees or luxury spas. It had the official seal of the state court pressed into the thick paper. I didn't come here tonight to give you a loan, Dad, I said, my voice steady and carrying clearly across the silent room. I do not lend my capital to failing, mismanaged businesses. It is a terrible investment strategy. Then why the hell are you still standing here? Mom cried out. Her voice was trembling so badly she sounded like she was shivering from the cold. She clutched her diamond necklace, her eyes darting frantically between me, Alina, and the blue folder. Why did you come here just to humiliate us? I looked directly into my father's eyes. I wanted to see the exact moment his world collapsed. I am here to make a purchase, I said. The room went entirely quiet again. It was a heavy, suffocating kind of quiet. It was the sound of 6 people holding their breath at the exact same time. My father was staring at the stack of papers under my hand. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. And in a way, he had. He was looking at the ghost of his own massive financial failures, the failures he had tried so desperately to bury under expensive suits and country club dinners. What are you talking about? Julian asked. He slowly sank back into his chair, his aggressive posture completely gone. Purchase what? The land? We aren't selling the dirt to you. A loan implies a foundational level of trust. I continued, ignoring Julian completely and speaking only to my father. A loan implies that I actually believe you have the competence to pay me back. I don't. I know you don't. However, I am a businessman. And when my acquisitions team spots a severely distressed asset with underlying geographical potential, I take decisive action. Distressed asset? Carter piped up, sounding thoroughly confused. He looked around the table. Dad, what does he mean by distressed asset? I knew about your catastrophic financial trouble exactly 3 weeks ago, I said, leaning forward slightly. My market intelligence team monitors regional commercial defaults. We saw the initial notice of default filed by First National. We saw the aggressive public filings from the private equity lender out in Chicago. You were bleeding out in public, Dad. I picked up the blue folder and held it up. I did not come here tonight to save you. I came here to foreclose on you. Foreclose? Dad spun around in his heavy wooden chair. He gripped the armrest so hard his knuckles turned pure white. You can't foreclose on me. You don't own the commercial debt. You are just a software kid. Actually, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that somehow echoed louder than a shout. I do. I tossed the blue folder across the table. It slid over the smooth white linen and stopped directly, perfectly in front of his empty dinner plate. Open it, I commanded. Dad's hands were shaking so violently, he could barely grip the edge of the heavy cover. He fumbled with it for a second before flipping it open. His eyes locked onto the first page. I watched his pupils frantically scan the dense legal text, the signatures, the official notary stamps. I watched his jaw go completely slack. This isn't possible, he whispered to the paper. His voice was completely gone. He sounded like a broken, defeated old man. This is illegal. What? Mom demanded, grabbing his arm and shaking it. Robert, what does it say? Tell me what it says. He bought the note, Dad whispered, not looking at her. He just kept staring blindly at the paper. He bought the second mortgage. I purchased your entire debt portfolio from the Chicago Private Equity Group yesterday morning, I explained calmly, making sure every single person at the table heard the mechanics of their destruction. They were absolutely thrilled to get rid of it. They knew you were going to default on the balloon payment next month anyway. I paid them 80 cents on the dollar. It was an absolute bargain, really? And First National? Dad asked, slowly looking up at me. There was raw, unadulterated horror in his eyes now. I acquired that primary debt this afternoon, I said, gesturing casually to Alina. Alina finalized the wire transfer with Mr. Sterling at the bank while you were all eating your shrimp cocktails. I placed my hands in my pockets and took a slow step back, taking in the entire table. I own the mortgage on this exclusive country club membership you love so much, Mom. I own the primary mortgage on the Miller Inn. I own the secondary lien on the lake house you are currently renovating. I own the corporate debt tied to the company vehicles. Jason dropped his heavy silver fork. It clattered loudly against his china plate, the sound sharp and jarring. You own everything? Carter asked, his voice shrinking until he sounded exactly like the terrified little boy he used to be when he lost a soccer game. "Everything," I confirmed flatly. "I am your primary creditor. I am the bank." I leaned in close to my father, resting my knuckles on the table. "So, when you stand up and tell me to get out and never come back, you might want to be extremely careful. Because technically speaking, you are currently sitting in a chair that I paid for." Dad slumped back against the heavy wood of his chair. All the bluster, all the arrogant, toxic patriarchy, all the aggressive energy simply drained out of his body like water out of a cracked pitcher. He wasn't the terrifying, domineering giant who used to dictate my life. He was just an exhausted, broke old man who owed a massive amount of money to the son he had constantly underestimated. "Why?" Mom whispered. Tears were freely streaming down her face now, ruining her makeup completely. She looked utterly terrified. "Why would you do this to your own family? Just to ruin us? Just for revenge?" "No, Mom," I said, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over me. "I did it to save the core business assets. But not for you. For me. This is the moment that changes everything. The moment I finally took back control of my life. Thank you so much for your patience and for staying with me until now. You've been amazing. Please give this video a like and comment 1 below to let me know you've made it this far. Not only does this help more people find this story, but it also lets me know that my experiences truly mean something to someone. Your support is my greatest motivation to keep sharing the rest of this journey." I turned back to Alina and gave her a sharp nod. She unzipped her leather briefcase and pulled out a fresh, single sheet of paper. She placed it face down on the table next to the blue folder. "These are the terms," I said, my tone shifting into pure, unyielding corporate negotiation. "Since you are currently in profound default on both the primary and secondary loans, I have the absolute legal right to seize the assets immediately. I could have the local sheriff kick you out of the family house tonight. I could put heavy steel padlocks on the doors of the motel tomorrow morning. I could freeze every single bank account tied to your names." Mom let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper and buried her face in her hands. "But," I continued, "I am not a cruel man. I am not you. I am offering you a clean exit." I reached out and slowly flipped the single piece of paper over. It was a certified cashier's check. "I am taking over full, uncontested ownership of the Miller Hospitality Group, effective immediately," I stated. "The current board of directors is dissolved. All executive positions are permanently terminated." I looked directly at Julian. "Your fake promotion is over. You are fired." I looked at my father. "You are forcefully retired. You can't just fire me." Julian yelled, half standing again, though his legs looked shaky. "I have a contract. I draw a salary. Your salary is paid by a company that no longer exists in its current form," I said coldly. "Check the table, Julian." "I just did." I pointed down at the cashier's check. "That check is a comprehensive severance package. It is made out for $200,000. That is for the total remaining equity of your entire lives. Frankly, it is significantly more than the business is actually worth when you factor in the toxic debt you've accumulated. You take that check, you sign the transfer documents, and you walk away clean. No crushing debt. No drawn-out lawsuits. No public bankruptcy. 200,000? Dad repeated weakly, staring at the numbers printed on the paper. But the land alone, the land has to be worth. The land is leverage to the hilt, Dad." I cut him off, completely lacking sympathy. "You own absolutely nothing. You are underwater. This check is a gift. It is the very last gift I will ever give you." Uncle Jeffrey gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady himself. "And what if your father refuses to sign your little extortion paper?" he challenged, trying to sound brave but mostly just sounding drunk. "Then I formally foreclose tomorrow morning at 8 a.m., I said simply, without a trace of bluffing. "I take the assets through the standard court proceedings. You get absolutely nothing. You go completely bankrupt. You lose the house to the bank. You lose the luxury cars to the repo men. But more importantly, you lose the one thing you actually care about. I paused, making sure they were all looking at me. You lose your reputation. Everyone at this country club, every one of your wealthy friends, will read in the Sunday paper that Robert Miller is a fraud who couldn't pay his bills. They will know you are destitute. I let the threat hang heavily in the air. I knew my parents. I knew their psychology perfectly. I knew that was the absolute kill shot. They could handle losing money. They could handle being poor in private. But they absolutely could not handle losing face in front of their high society friends. Public embarrassment was a fate worse than death to them. You have exactly 5 minutes to sign the transfer agreement, I said. I pulled back my sleeve and checked my watch. It wasn't a Rolex. It was a cheap, simple digital watch I bought years ago. The clock starts right now. I turned my back on them and walked slowly over to the massive bay window at the far end of the room. I looked out through the glass at the sprawling, perfectly manicured golf course stretching out into the dark night. I could see my own reflection in the thick glass. I didn't look angry. I didn't look sad. I looked incredibly calm. I looked strong. Behind me, the gold room descended into absolute chaos. I heard the frantic, messy sounds of my family completely falling apart. I heard Mom sobbing uncontrollably, wailing about the shame and the scandal. I heard Julian pacing the floor, cursing violently under his breath, muttering about his divorce lawyers and how his ex-wife was going to destroy him in the custody hearing when she found out he was unemployed and broke. I heard Carter whining about how he was supposed to pay for his apartment. I didn't turn around. I just stood there, watching the distant lights of the golf carts moving in the dark. 3 minutes, Alina's cold voice announced behind me. She was keeping time perfectly. The arguing intensified, then suddenly dropped into a fierce, desperate whispering. They were trapped, and they knew it. There was no escape hatch. There was no wealthy uncle to bail them out this time. There was only the brutal reality of their own actions catching up to them. Then I heard it, the heavy, distinct scratch of a high-end fountain pen pressing hard against thick paper. They were signing their entire empire, their entire legacy, over to the invisible son they had spent 30 years trying to forget. I waited for the scratching sound to stop entirely. I gave it a few more seconds of heavy silence before I finally turned away from the window and walked back to the table. My father was still holding the gold pen. His large, thick hand was shaking so violently that the metal tip of the pen was tapping erratically against the mahogany table like a nervous, dying heartbeat. Tap, tap, tap. He slowly looked up at me. There was absolutely no anger left in his eyes. There was no arrogance. There was only a hollow, pathetic desperation. He looked like a man standing on the very edge of a crumbling cliff, looking down at the massive drop below, realizing that the ground he thought was solid had already given way. "Nathan," he croaked. His voice cracked terribly. "Please, the legacy, the Miller name. We spent 40 years building that name in this town. The name is perfectly safe, Dad," I said, my voice like ice. "I am keeping the name on the properties. I am just changing the management to someone who actually knows how to run a balance sheet." He looked over at my mother. She was staring blankly at the ruined white tablecloth, weeping silently, her mascara a dark mess. She didn't say a word. She just gave him a tiny, almost invisible nod of defeat. She knew the game was completely over. If they didn't take the check, they would face the devastating humiliation of a very public foreclosure. They would be dragged through the local courts. Their country club friends would gossip about them endlessly. For people like my parents, poverty is terrifying, but social embarrassment is fatal. Dad looked back down at the legal document. He pressed the pen down one last time and signed his name at the bottom. Robert Miller. It wasn't his usual bold, sweeping signature. It was a messy, shaky scrawl. It looked exactly like a surrender. He pushed the paper away from him as if it were coated in poison and dropped the pen. "It's done," he whispered to the table. Alina stepped forward instantly. She didn't hesitate. She picked up the document, quickly and efficiently checked the signature for validity, and pulled a heavy notary stamp from her briefcase. Thump. She stamped the paper, making it official. She placed a countersigned copy of the agreement on the table in front of him. "Thank you," Alina said, her tone strictly business. "The transfer of total ownership and all associated assets is legally binding as of this exact moment." I walked around to my father's side of the table. I picked up the cashier's check for $200,000. I held it out to him. "Here," I said. He didn't reach for it. He just stared at his empty hands resting in his lap. Before the paper could fall, Julian snatched it out of my hand. He held it up, his eyes wide, greed warring heavily with absolute panic. 200 grand, Julian muttered, doing the frantic math in his head. That's practically nothing split between us. That won't even buy a decent condo in a good neighborhood. How am I supposed to pay my divorce lawyer with this? It is exactly $200,000 more than you had 5 minutes ago, Julian, I said sharply. And speaking of assets, you need to hand over the Porsche keys. Right now. Julian's head snapped up, his face turning an even lighter shade of pale. What? No, absolutely no way. I need my car. How the hell am I supposed to get back to my apartment? Call an Uber, I suggested coldly. Take a taxi. Walk. I don't care. The Porsche is a registered company vehicle. The company now belongs entirely to me, and it is against my corporate policy to allow terminated employees to drive company assets. Keys. Now. You can't do this to us. Carter whined, finally speaking up, panic raising the pitch of his voice. What about my monthly allowance? What about the college fund Grandpa left me? What about my trust fund? I looked at my younger brother. I actually felt a tiny, brief flash of pity for him. He was completely clueless. Your trust fund and your college fund were heavily invested in the motel chain's equity, Carter. I explained slowly, like I was talking to a child. Dad drained both of those accounts 5 years ago to pay for the massive roof repairs on the East Wing because he didn't have commercial insurance. Didn't he tell you? Carter slowly turned his head and looked at Dad with absolute horror. You spent my money? My college fund. Dad didn't answer him. He didn't even flinch. He just remained slumped in his chair, staring at nothing, completely broken. The great Robert Miller, the man who had terrified and controlled me for 20 years, was just an empty suit. And the house? Mom asked. Her voice was barely a raspy whisper. Nathan, surely you aren't going to take the family house. Where will your father and I live? I looked down at my mother. I remembered the way she used to look at me when I was a child, like I was a muddy stain on her perfect, expensive white carpet. I remembered the countless times she had ignored my calls, dismissed my feelings, and prioritized a country club luncheon over her own son. I remembered her dancing at the bar while I sat alone in an empty restaurant. The house was put up as collateral on the First National loan 3 years ago, I said, stating the legal facts without an ounce of emotion. It technically belongs to the bank. And as we just established, I am the bank. I paused, letting the crushing reality fully sink into her mind. I am giving you exactly 30 days, I said. Legally, that is incredibly generous. Most hostile banks would serve you with a 10-day eviction notice. You have 30 days to pack your belongings and vacate the property. I highly suggest you use your portion of that severance check to find a modest rental property. Maybe something cozy in the suburbs. A rental, Mom gasped, clutching her chest as if she had just been physically shot. I cannot live in a rental. What will the girls at the club say? What will my friends think? Tell them you're downsizing, I suggested dryly. Or, for the first time in your life, try telling them the truth. Tell them you spent decades pretending to be incredibly rich while completely neglecting the actual business that fed you. Uncle Jeffrey, who had been uncharacteristically silent since the threat of bankruptcy was placed on the table, suddenly stood up. He swayed dangerously, knocking his chair back. His face was red and sweaty. You're a monster, Uncle Jeffrey spat at me, slurring his words heavily. A cold-hearted, vindictive monster. Family is supposed to stick together through the hard times. Where is your loyalty? Loyalty is a two-way street, Uncle Jeffrey, I said, my voice dangerously low. You were fiercely loyal to the free money, the free drinks, and the free rides. You were never loyal to me. And by the way, I highly suggest you stop drinking on my dime. I looked at the five of them one last, long time. It felt like I was looking at an old photograph that was rapidly fading in the sun. Dad, defeated and broken, his legacy gone. Mom, utterly terrified of her fake social standing collapsing into dust. Julian and Carter, two overgrown children suddenly realizing they would actually have to get jobs and work for a living. Uncle Jeffrey, a drunk old man who had finally run out of hosts to leech off. I stood there, waiting for the heavy sadness to finally hit me. I waited for the guilt. I waited to feel bad for destroying them. But the sadness never came. Instead, I felt a massive, incredible weight lift entirely off my chest. It was an intensely physical sensation. My tight shoulders dropped. My lungs expanded, pulling in a deep, full breath of air for what felt like the first time in my life. I realized that for 30 years, I had been carrying the crushing weight of their expectations. I had been carrying their harsh judgments. I had been exhausting myself trying to fill a bucket with water, never realizing the bucket had a massive hole in the bottom. Now I was finally putting the bucket down. Alina, I said, not taking my eyes off them. Handle the keys. Yes, sir, Alina said crisply. She stepped forward and held her open hand out directly toward Julian. Julian looked at me, pure hatred burning in his eyes, then looked at Alina's waiting hand. He cursed violently under his breath, a string of foul words. He dug aggressively into his tailored pants pocket, pulled out the silver Porsche key fob, and slammed it down hard into Alina's palm. I hope you choke on all this money, Nathan, Julian snarled, his face twisted in ugly rage. I won't, I replied calmly. I actually have excellent digestion. I turned my back on them for the final time. I started walking toward the heavy wooden double doors of the gold room. My footsteps felt incredibly light. Nathan, Dad's voice called out behind me. It was weak, cracking, a pathetic shadow of his former boom. Nathan, wait. I stopped walking. I rested my hand on the cool brass handle of the door, but I didn't turn around. What? I asked. We did love you, he stammered, his voice thick with unshed tears. In our own way, we did. I stood there in silence for 2 full seconds. I thought about the heavy state science fair medal hidden in my pocket. I thought about the 5 empty chairs at Le Jardin. I thought about the text message demanding I show up to fund their fake resort. No, Dad, I said softly to the wooden door. You loved having a son you could safely ignore until he suddenly became useful to your bank account. That isn't love. That is ownership. I pushed the heavy door open. And I'm not for sale anymore. I walked out of the gold room and into the softly lit hallway. Behind me, the heavy wooden doors swung shut, clicking into place with a solid, incredibly final sound. It sounded exactly like the heavy steel door of a bank vault locking forever. I walked slowly through the grand lobby of the Oak Haven Country Club. The chaotic dinner rush was over. The space was mostly quiet, filled only with the soft sounds of a piano playing in the corner. A few wealthy older men and women were sitting in the plush lounge chairs, sipping expensive brandy and laughing quietly about their golf scores. They casually glanced up as I walked past them. They saw a man in a frayed gray sweater and scuffed shoes. They saw a nobody. They had absolutely no idea who I was. They had no idea that the quiet man in the cheap clothes walking past their table had just purchased the biggest debt portfolio their exclusive club had ever seen. I smiled softly to myself. I genuinely liked being a nobody to them. It meant I was entirely free from their judgment. I pushed through the front doors and stepped out into the crisp night air. It was cool and incredibly clear. I looked up and saw the stars shining brightly against the black sky. Inside that gold room, the air had been hot, suffocating, thick with lies, panic, and expensive perfume. Out here, the air was clean, tasted like absolute freedom. I took a deep breath and started walking down the wide stone steps toward the valet stand. As I walked, I felt a vibration in my pocket. I pulled out my phone. The screen lit up with a new text message. It had come through less than 2 minutes ago. It was from Mom. "Nady, my baby boy, please. Let's talk about this rationally. Don't do this to your family. I can fix this whole mess. I will make your dad apologize to you right now. Just come back inside the room. We can work something out, a compromise. You are my baby boy. I love you." I stopped walking and stared at the glowing words. Baby boy. She only ever used that sickeningly sweet phrase when she was desperate to manipulate me into doing exactly what she wanted. She was still trying. Even now, after I had laid out the legal documents, after I had stripped them of their empire, she honestly thought she could just pull a maternal string and I would dance like a good little puppet. She thought I was still that desperate, lonely little kid waiting in the rain for her approval. I didn't feel a spike of anger. I didn't feel the urge to text back a long, hateful paragraph. I just felt completely, wonderfully done. I tapped the 3 small dots in the top right corner of the message screen. A menu dropped down. I selected the option highlighted in red, block caller. I watched her name vanish. Then I opened my contacts list. I found Robert Miller. Block. Julian Miller. Block. Carter Miller. Block. Uncle Jeffrey. Block. I watched their names disappear one by one from my active digital life. It was a clean, bloodless digital surgery. I was finally cutting out the deep infection that had plagued me for 30 years. I slid the phone back into my pocket, feeling lighter than I ever had. I reached the bottom of the steps just as the young valet jogged up. He looked at my ticket, then frowned deeply. He clearly remembered me from earlier. "The 2016 sedan, sir?" he asked, wrinkling his nose slightly, clearly judging me for driving such a piece of junk to a place like this. "Yes," I said smoothly. "The sedan." He jogged off into the sprawling lot. A few minutes later, the dull, faded car pulled up under the bright awning. The engine rattled loudly, and the brakes let out a high-pitched squeak as he brought it to a stop. Parked next to a gleaming new Mercedes and a polished BMW, my car looked absolutely ridiculous. The valet stepped out and held the driver's door open for me. He stood there, holding his hand out slightly, looking like he expected a meager $2 tip, but also looking like he thoroughly judged me for driving a rusted trash can. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my money clip. I slid out a crisp, brand new $100 bill. I placed it flat into his waiting hand. "Keep the change," I said, offering him a genuine smile. The young man's eyes went wide as saucers. He stared at the bill, then looked back up at me, his judgment instantly replaced by absolute shock. "Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. Have a great night." I slid into the driver's seat. The fabric was worn thin. The steering wheel was peeling slightly under my grip. The car was incredibly imperfect. It was old, it was dented, and it was loud. But it was entirely mine. I bought it with my own hard-earned money. I paid for the gas. I paid for the insurance. I didn't owe a single red cent to anyone in the world for this vehicle, or for anything else in my life. I turned the key. The engine roared to life, shaky but reliable. I put it in drive and steered the rattling sedan down the long, winding, perfectly manicured driveway. I drove past the rigid flower beds, past the towering iron gates, and pulled out onto the main highway leading back toward the glowing lights of the city. I rolled down the windows, letting the cool night wind rush in and whip my hair around. I thought about what I was leaving behind in that heavy, dark room. I was leaving behind a toxic family legacy that was built entirely on lies, debt, and arrogance. I was leaving behind the desperate, clawing need to be considered good enough by people who were never ever good enough for me. I was leaving behind the deep, burning shame of being the invisible black sheep. I looked through the windshield at the open road ahead of me. I thought about my company. I thought about the hundreds of brilliant employees who genuinely respected my leadership. I thought about my quiet penthouse, my own space, my own future. I realized something important as the miles rolled by. True revenge isn't about screaming at the people who hurt you. It isn't about getting into a fistfight or plotting ways to make them physically suffer. Real, lasting revenge is simply being incredibly happy without them. Real revenge is waking up one day and realizing you genuinely do not need them to survive. Real revenge is building yourself up, becoming so whole, so completely successful and self-reliant, that the people who tried to break you simply cease to matter. They were just footnotes now. Small, sad, irrelevant scribbles at the very bottom of the massive page of my life. I reached over and turned up the radio. A classic rock song I loved was playing through the crackling speakers. I started to hum along, tapping my fingers against the worn steering wheel. I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The bright, arrogant lights of the Oak Haven Country Club were rapidly fading into the distance, shrinking until they were nothing but tiny, insignificant specks of light swallowed up by the dark. I turned my eyes back to the road ahead. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating my path. I wasn't the victim anymore. I wasn't the invisible middle son. I wasn't the family ATM. I was Nathan, and for the very first time in my 30 years of life, I was driving my own car on my own road, going exactly where I wanted to go. Thank you for sticking around and listening to my story. It wasn't an easy one to tell, but getting it out there feels like taking a deep breath of fresh air. I hope this resonated with you in some way, especially if you've ever felt like you were standing in the shadows of your own life. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation? Have you ever had to walk away from people who were supposed to care about you in order to finally save yourself? I would really love to read your stories, so please share them down below. And before you go, I have a quick request for the 1% Club. That's what I call those of you who actually stay until the very end of the video. If you are hearing my voice right now, drop the letter W in the comments. It stands for winner. It's our little secret code so I can see exactly who the real winners are in this community, the ones who see things through to the end. If you enjoyed this, please hit that like button, and don't forget to follow the channel so we can share more stories together. Take care of yourselves, and remember, you are always the author of your own life. See you in the next one.